Hey internets, in this video I'm just going to quickly go over the economic illiteracy of canceling all the student debt. This is an idea that's obviously very popular with a lot of college students, especially recent graduates, and I can definitely see as someone who was a recent graduate at one time in the past myself, where if you don't think about it from anything other than just a personal individual level, it can definitely seem to you like you'll benefit from it. But when you think about it a bit more seriously beyond the first order effects that it has, you'll quickly realize it's actually a really bad idea. In fact, it's one of the worst ideas. And I'll explain the problem with it as well as the mentality of the people who have this idea by refuting this little comic right here that has been recently making the rounds again. We got a guy here saying, "I beat cancer," looking very proud of himself, and then saying if they suddenly find a cure for cancer, now I'm gonna be so mad. This comic is about student loans. Now, I love this comic, not because it's good, it's a very bad argument, but because it's a good example of how people who believe in Santaism genuinely do not understand market forces. So it's a perfect example of the Fractal Wrongness meme, where somebody is so wrong about something that it kind of just reveals how they have a critical lack of understanding of the basics of the basics of the basics of what they're talking about, and thus most of everything else they have to say about the subject is probably also wrong. Or at the very least, you can't really take anything else they have to say about it seriously. Because of course, the reasoning in this comic only makes sense if you genuinely believe in what we like to call economic Santaism, which is where people who think that free stuff from the government is genuinely free, that it doesn't come from anywhere. So in other words, they just kind of view it as the same as, Santa flying around in a sleigh and producing presents just out of magic thin air for everybody. And the problem, of course, is that it doesn't work that way. To put it very simply, it is of course paid by the taxpayer. And due to tax incidents, you will always be paying part of those taxes, regardless of who specifically the taxes target, which in this specific case of ending student loans is very interesting. So for instance, let's say that we were to pay for free student university education and ending all current federal student loans through, say, a 3 to 5% increase in income taxes, depending on your income level. And what's funny about that is that if you go to college, you will on average earn more money throughout your lifetime. In fact, even the quote-unquote useless degrees, those silly liberal arts degrees, they tend to still increase the amount you'll earn throughout your life, but not nearly as much as the actual decent STEM degrees, which I'll argue are the ones you should probably be getting. Which means that if you are in your 30s as a result of your college education finding yourself in a position where you have a salary of, say, $90K or above, you're going to be a net taxpayer into this system, which means you're still going to be paying back your student loans. In fact, you'll actually, throughout your lifetime, probably end up paying more of those student loans than what you would have paid in the current privatized system. The only time that this is not the case is the people who were rock bottom of the totem pole regarding college education. So in other words, the people who not only went to useless underwater genderqueer dance theory degrees, but also just did nothing to ensure that they would have any kind of career afterwards. Which means that the only people who wouldn't end up being net taxpayers into this system anyways, and thus paying back their student loans anyways, would be the lazy ones who spent their college years partying and wasting their money on smoking the ganja instead of actually planning further for their life beyond just getting a degree. So they find themselves with a useless liberal arts major and yet working at Starbucks when they're 35. Which in other words means that making the student loans quote-unquote free not only doesn't actually make it free, but you're actually subsidizing the students who were irresponsible on the dime of the students who were not. And that's not even counting people who didn't even go to college, which makes this actually a really weird form of taxation where they're kind of taxing the poor in order to pay for the rich, or really taxing the poor in order to pay for the middle class. Because of course, extremely poor people don't even go to college. And while they're not net taxpayers, the taxes they would pay would still go into this, even if they're at the bottom of that 3%. And so in other words, the whole idea is an example of what we call champagne socialism, in that the biggest payoffs would mainly go to lazy, privileged upper middle class kids who through their own hubris viewed going to college as a partying opportunity rather than taking their education seriously. It is an absolutely massive spit in the face to anybody who's, say, born to a poor family, works their butt off in order to get into a good college, takes their classes seriously in order to ensure that they have a decent path to a decent career, and so they can then, through that work, get a better life and then pay those loans back. Imagine being that guy and then being told that, okay, you now have to subsidize the spoiled upper middle class kids who would rather spend all their money fueling their drug addiction than actually taking their life seriously. And when you realize this, when you realize the fact that this idea is really just screwing over responsible people in order to pay for the irresponsible, you realize another problem with the point of this comic, which is that it is a massive false equivalency. The point that the comic is of course making is that it's equating student loans to the concept of someone beating cancer and then being mad at someone beating cancer, in the same way that people who manage to pay off their student loans might occasionally get mad at people who would get them for quote-unquote free if we decided to go with the socialist policy of abolishing student debt, which is ridiculous because the economics of these two subjects are completely the opposite. When someone beats cancer and then they find a better cure for that cancer, that doesn't come at the cost to you. It's not like them finding a better cure for cancer will cause your cancer to come back. In fact, in this case, it's more or less a positive sum experience, because of course, cancer is a medical science issue. Whenever somebody beats cancer, we generally get better at finding treatment for that cancer because that provides us with data on what works best to beat that cancer depending on whatever cancer you got. So, which means that you're automatically benefiting future patients. And the thing is, those patients in the future are also benefiting you, because if you beat cancer, the reality is, unfortunately, there's also a good chance that you might get that same cancer again sometime in your life. Which means that if medical science finds a complete cure to the type of cancer that you got, it was most likely due to multiple studies and trials being done on multiple patients who all got the same cancer, and therefore you actually would benefit from them finding that cure, which is completely different from student loans. If you paid back your student loans, that means you probably got a career capable of paying back those loans, which means that if they enact some new policy in order to tax people more in order to make student debt free, well, that positive sum relationship in the case of cancer is not the case. In this instance, you would be the responsible person being forced to pay for the irresponsible person, and you wouldn't be gaining anything out of it. And there's also the issue of cost. In the case of cancer, everybody who beats cancer tends to improve the treatment of cancer, which can actually reduce the cost of treating it. Or at least it would if the FDA wasn't corrupt and didn't grant unnatural monopolies on certain treatments. But that's a subject for a different video. Anyways, the point is, going back to universities and costs, you again have the opposite problem. Ending student loan debt would not end college costs. The costs and everything required to run universities and campuses would all still be there. In fact, it would actually incentivize universities to increase those costs, because if they know that the government is going to subsidize those loans by socializing the loans, then they can actually earn more money by jacking up the tuition price. And so student loan forgiveness doesn't lower the price, it makes it even more, which means that students in the future who are responsible will end up also paying more, which means that this comic is comparing a situation that directly harms you to a situation that directly benefits you, and pretending like they are the same thing, which means that the person who made this comic and the people spreading it unironically do not understand the difference between positive and negative sum. So yeah, like I said earlier, fractally wrong. Anybody who makes this argument is effectively admitting that they do not understand very basic things about how the world works. They're only really thinking about it from the standpoint of wanting to not have to pay back their loans, and that's pretty much it. That's the extent of their reasoning. And that's sadly the good faith interpretation. The bad faith interpretation would be that they do understand why this is wrong. They fully understand why comparing subsidizing irresponsibility to something that deals with the advancement of medical science is obviously a very silly and very ridiculous false equivocation, and they're just pretending not to because they're socialists and they want to advance the ideology of socialism. Facts and evidence be darned. And so they just pretend to not understand things in order to gaslight people. The reality is, you took out a loan, you should pay it back. That's how student loans work. And I know it's painful. I mean, I've been there myself. Getting those bills right after you graduate as you're just starting your career is not fun, but it's the right thing to do. You borrowed that money under the promise that you would pay them back, under the bet that you would be making more money in the future. Now, sure, you could make the complaint here that the younger generations, us millennials and Gen Z, we were oversold the idea of college education by the boomers, and that the lifestyle promised to us by them was based on a world that arguably doesn't exist anymore. But the thing is, that's more of a big picture problem. It's more of an issue with the decline of Westernism in general, which has overwhelmingly been caused by socialist policies and the ballooning of the state, of which canceling student loan debt would just make that a bigger problem, which is what tends to happen when you blame the symptom of the problem rather than the root cause of the problem, which is essentially what the whole student debt crisis here is. It's kind of the same fallacy of people blaming the landlord for the fact that they owe rent, rather than blaming our regulators for intentionally limiting the supply of housing and thus making housing unaffordable. Same issue here. It's our corrupt relationship between businesses and the state and regulatory capture, combined with flooding the West with welfare recipients from the third world and artificially reducing the number of businesses that can even offer a decent job in the first place, that is at fault here. And so when you're blaming the fact that the degree itself costs a lot of of money, well, that's just kind of short-sighted and fails to see the bigger picture. The only case where I could see where it kind of makes sense that you shouldn't have to pay back your student loans is in those very rare edge case scenarios where you are somebody who went to one of those private college schools that actually scammed and misled their students, and it was proven in court that they scammed their students by directly lying to them about what their campus had to offer. And there are some cases where, yeah, that has been proven in court. But the thing is, in that case, it still shouldn't be the taxpayer that would pay back those loans. There's no need to subsidize that. In that case, it should be the scammers who should have to pay that loan back. It should be the people who misled those students, which has happened before. Like, for example, there was a school, Les Cordons Bleus, that was found guilty in court of misrepresenting itself to prospective students. And so they had to pay back a portion of the tuition. But again, that's a very edge case scenario. That's very rare. And of course, that sort of thing doesn't require the state and the IRS to get involved. But let's be honest, none of the people who are spreading this comic and this argument around fit into this bill. I mean, maybe some of them do, but in their case, they should be filing something known as the borrower's defense to repayment, not demanding that all student loan debt be canceled just because they happen to get scammed. That would, of course, be very silly. I would not be surprised at all if they were mostly disproportionately a bunch of Redditors who went in for some useless liberal arts degree and attended just the standard local state university rather than any career-specific school. They're not pushing this idea because they got scammed. They're pushing this idea because they believe that the state is Santa Claus and they want free stuff. And TLDR, it's wrong because that's just not true. That's not how the economy works. You took out a loan, pay it back. And that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, by buying some merch, or by becoming a member of the channel. Thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.